So I'll say a few words on the migration part of the presentation. There you mention that people care about the composition of immigrants. And that composition has been changing a good bit in many receiving countries. So if you think of Northern Europe, there immigration has shifted from Italians to Turks to Syrians and other Asians and Africans, sort of parallel to that trend that you pointed out maybe in the aversion against immigration. Instead, there's much less backlash against the large wave of Ukrainian immigration, for instance, recently. And so I do think that part of the story is cultural concerns, prejudice more generally, including racism. I think that's all part of that story, of the story. We can't quite neglect that. Now, if on top of that, immigration less often leads to a permanent settlement, then we can also expect less integration maybe, and another bit of animosity from the side of natives. Still, I think so. Those changes in how immigration looks like, where people come from, and how long they stay, probably only goes some part in explaining those trends, because in the end, there's, I think, social and political developments in receiving countries where other issues are projected on immigration. So if you think of the take back control argument in the Brexit debate, that was a lot broader than just about immigration, but immigration is probably a topic that's more easy to grasp as well. Now, what economists have thought about much longer, of course, are labor market effects of immigration, and that's still probably the most prominent and also influential strand of the economic literature on immigration, partly because it's somewhat controversial, partly because there's interest way beyond academic circles. And so the Mariel Boatlift paper, or your Journal of Labor Economics paper that introduced shift share instruments to the migration literature are major milestones in that one. The broad conclusions, you said, are that the wage effect of immigration is small. And so maybe to have everyone on the same page on the magnitudes we're talking about here, a common quantity that's estimated in this literature is the semi-elasticity of native wages with respect to the immigrant share in the population or the workforce. And estimates are somewhere between -0.1 and 0 mostly. Sometimes positive, sometimes a bit more negative, but think of that range. So that means that a 10 percentage point increase in the immigrant share, which is a lot. So in Italy, that would amount to a doubling of immigration, basically. So such a large increase would reduce native wages by 1% or less if we're closer to 0, right? So by all means, this is a small effect, and probably smaller than what most people would think of or can even picture. Now, if you bring that together with a common overestimation of the scale of immigration, where surveys show that people perceive the immigrant share to be of the order of 30% in the population, so 2 or 3 times as many as there actually are. Once you bring these two together, you have a fairly strong disconnect between people's perception of the potential economic impact of immigration and the empirical evidence that we have. And so I think, besides people caring about compositional concerns, cultural impact and the like that you pointed at, to the extent that they do care about the economic impact, I think perceptions are way exaggerated, and that probably contributes to animosity there as well. Now, you pointed at some directions for future research, and I'll add 2 more. One on the treatment and one on mechanisms. The treatment in this literature is a change in the immigrant share, typically. But, so about the scale of immigration, a change in the scale of immigration. But when it comes to immigration policy, it's rarely actually the scale that is targeted directly by countries. In some cases it is. So Canada is aiming to expand the number of permanent residents by between 400,000 and 500,000 a year. If you go to the websites of the Canadian authorities, you have that for this year and projection for the next few years. So there you have the scale of immigration targeted. In the US, most prominent, you would have a cap on H-1B visas of 65,000 a year, although that's only a fairly small share of immigration to the US, but right there you have the number targeted. In Europe, we don't have that so often. You do have absolute numbers surfacing every now and then in populist debates, like think of David Cameron's pledge to bring net migration to the UK down to the tens of thousands. So yeah, there you have it, again, scale. But other than that, immigration policy typically is about whom you let in, much more than how many you let in. So immigration legislation would specify under which conditions someone is allowed to enter a country, to work in that country, and then it depends on how many people on the planet satisfy those conditions and actually want to go to that country and have the means to do so, and that then determines the scale of migration that you have, rather than a direct target of that scale. And so some people would enter under visas that are tied to qualifications or to family relations or to employment in certain sectors, or to being politically persecuted. And I don't think the economic literature has quite reached that level of specificity. And I think it matters, though, for policy advice, where people entering under different circumstances will have different impacts. Second, on the mechanisms. So this literature estimates an overall net effect that results from multiple potentially offsetting channels. And I think there's a good bit of evidence that we're not just looking at a rightward shift in the labor supply curve. So you pointed at the speed of investment, of complementary factors that is important. And I think there's many other channels as well that are going on here. And maybe that's best observed if you compare estimates from different contexts. So in some settings that people have studied, like cross-border commuting of Czech workers into Bavarian counties, or Mexican migration to the US, which often is temporary as well. Some studies have found stronger effects. In the US, more in wages, in that German case, more in employment. But those are settings where a fair share of immigrant earnings are not actually spent locally, but in immigrants' country of origin. So you have an expansion in labor supply that is accompanied by a relatively weaker increase in the demand for local goods and services, which in other contexts, like the ones that are mostly studied, including the Mariel boat lift, so where we think of a more traditional, more permanent form of immigration, there you have an expansion typically of aggregate demand that can offset some of the labor supply effects. And so I think we are well aware of these other, often macroeconomic channels, but we haven't got quite as far in quantifying them. And I think there's some work to be done. You probably can make a similar argument for minimum wages as well, and their impact on aggregate demand. But I'll leave that to Erika. For the case of migration, there's an immediate policy relevance really of this, because visa policies, as well as public discourse, often favors labor migrants over, quote unquote, less productive family migrants, for instance. But if labor migrants spend a larger share of their income locally, if their families are allowed to enter as well, then that makes a difference for the economic impact of immigration. And I think you can expand this to the fiscal impact of immigration, on which there's much less research than on the labor market effects of immigration. I think from the studies that we have for the UK or the US, these point to fairly significant positive impact. But I think I made the point. So I think there's some need to quantify really the channels behind the overall net effect also for policy advice. Now, of course, this net effect is important, and it's a first number to look for. And David's estimates are certainly among the most credible and solid ones that we have. So there's something good to build on. But we do have that building, I think, in getting more at the channels behind, and also sometimes maybe zooming in more than what economists are used to be for policy advice. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, let me first thank David for the inspiring talk. He has certainly inspired my research, and so it's an honor, to do this discussion. So David's research has challenged the long-standing belief that the minimum wage necessarily lead to job losses. And his work has sparked hundreds, I don't know how many papers, to really dig more into the impact of the minimum wage on employment, and I would say that the vast majority indeed find a zero employment effect. Now, many people still disagree, many politicians, but I think it is fair to say at this point that if you take the literature or the evidence at face value, I would say the employment effect of the minimum wage, we could say it's elusive. But one question which, there has been a lot of research on is why this is the case. And as David mentioned, one story is one of labor market not being competitive. But there are in fact other stories, and I just wanted to maybe, talk a bit about these other stories. Another story is that the minimum wage may not raise the cost of labor that much for firms, despite the fact that it increases wages. The fact that there is now very micro data, very detailed micro data, payroll data, and other type of data have allowed a lot of research to really dig into this. So one story could be that the minimum wage increases wages, but maybe firms compensate by being less generous on other aspects of the contract, such as maybe they start giving, worse health benefit, less health benefits. Maybe they start cutting, not allowing workers to take coffee breaks or meal breaks, or maybe they cut on training, maybe they cut on fringe benefits. There has been some research on this, and right now there doesn't seem to be much evidence in support of this sort of offsetting behavior on the side of firms. There's another reasons why the minimum wage may not raise the cost of labor that much, and it's that possibly the minimum wage may increase worker productivity, and this is a part of research which I've contributed, which I've worked on. But the idea is the following, is that if the minimum wage raises worker productivity, productivity is definitely good for firms, and so in a way this may offset the cost, the increased wage bill that the firms is facing. Now, why should the minimum wage increases worker productivity? There are different stories, but one of them is in line with the famous efficiency wage theory, which states that if the minimum wage increases, the value of the job increases relative to losing that job and then having to being unemployed for a while, and so workers may have an incentive to provide more effort in order to avoid bearing the cost of being laid off. This is, again, maybe, very good for the firm, maybe not that good for the worker, and I'll come to that in a second. But empirically, this is really hard to document because it's hard to measure effort and productivity. It's a very important topic to study, not only to assess the effect of the minimum wage on employment, but also to understand the effect of the minimum wage on worker welfare. And worker welfare is, there are a number of existing papers looking at worker welfare. It's really hard to look at worker welfare because from a data point of view, you really need data on effort, on every aspect of compensation, both monetary but also non-monetary. If the minimum wage increases workers' pay, but this at the same time raises effort on the side of workers, then the welfare effect of the minimum wage may be positive, but not as positive as we initially thought. Now, I just wanted to mention a recent paper of mine where we look at workers in a large US retailer, one of the largest US retailer, nationwide, spanning basically across the US. And what we see is that when the minimum wage increases, low-paid workers do see an increase in their wage, which is good, but we also see an increase in their productivity, a substantial increase in their productivity. This leads to less labor turnover, so less turnover, which is actually in line with some more macro evidence on this. The question here is, what's the impact of the minimum wage on worker welfare? And we find that the effect of the minimum wage on worker welfare is a positive one, but probably not as positive as if one was not considering the effort response, because obviously providing more effort and being more productive may be a cost for the worker. One thing which is quite intriguing in the data, I just wanted to point out, is that we find that the effort response is much stronger among women. In fact, the minimum wage triggers an increase in productivity which is twice as large among women than men. And we show in the paper that this is mostly due to the fact that women have worse outside options. So when they lose a job, it's hard to find a new job, and when they do find a job, the job typically pays less. So they really have an incentive to provide more effort to avoid bearing the cost of losing this job, which is now better paying than it used to be. From a wealth perspective, at the macro level, the minimum wage is certainly a policy that benefits women more than men. And in the paper, we show that this is indeed the case in our company, because women tend to have positions which are lower paid positions. However, the sort of controversial result that we find is that if you compare a woman and a man in the exact same job, it actually seems that women benefit less than men from a higher minimum wage, because they get a similar increase in pay, at least at the lower level of the hierarchy in the firm, but they have to provide more effort, and this is costly. So this is just to say, probably now we have very detailed data, from within the firm. It would be interesting to start analyzing really the effect on worker welfare and inequalities of different types within the firm. Just one last point I wanted to make, circling back to the question on employment, is that one question which is very important and we still have little evidence on, and this is really expanding on David's research, is the question of how high can the minimum wage be raised without triggering a negative employment effect. Now, the range of minimum wages that people have studied, a lot of work from David, of course, are relatively modest, we could say, and do not trigger a strong negative employment effect. But presumably, if people were going for really high minimum wage, you could see a negative employment effect appearing, and the question is, at which point are we seeing that? Now, this is an important policy question, because recently we have seen some regions going for crazy high minimum wages. In fact, or discussing at least very high minimum wages. So this month, just at the beginning of May, the French government increased the minimum wage to 65% of the median income. Some cities in Zurich, some cities in Switzerland, such as the city of Zurich, have just passed the minimum wage, which is very high, and we expect some cities in the US to increase the minimum wage to much higher levels. As you know, in Italy, there is a very hot debate on whether to increase the level of the minimum wage. In fact, whether to first of all introduce a statutory minimum wage in Italy, and then there is also a debate on what level should the new minimum wage be in Italy. And some parties are proposing to introduce a minimum wage that goes up to 80% of median income, which would make Italy sort of the most generous in terms of level of in terms of relative level, let me say, in the whole Europe. So are these parties right? Is it correct? I mean, is it a good idea to have a minimum wage which is that high? Are we risking at that point to have a negative employment effect, and could we potentially hurt workers or not? I mean, this is a question we don't know much about. There is some recent theory and structural evidence, some macro evidence as well, on the fact that, at least in the US context, levels such as the one proposed in Italy may not be optimal, maybe too high, but we have little empirical evidence de facto on how high we can go without creating this negative employment effect. And from a policy point of view, and given the fact that minimum wages are being adopted and that their levels are raising, it seems to me that it's an important question to tackle. And I think I'll stop here.
So thank you so much, Erika and Simon. David, you want to react now, or you want that we take a few questions from the floor and then you say a few words later on? Yeah, we can take a few. So who is brave enough to say something? While waiting, perhaps I say a couple of things. Simply that, this is, I really enjoy very much this lecture because, usually economists think that what they say is affecting policies and changing the way of thinking about policy making. Here is a typical case where, to some extent, it was the other way around. So economists learn from policies, clearly coupled with data and good method, and change their mind to some extent. Now, perhaps we can push the rethinking a bit further on both issues. Minimum wages, clearly this led us to think more about the wage setting power of employers, so monopsony model that had been put in a closet for a long time. But there is an additional finding that you mentioned, David, before. So this effect on prices, which is a bit at odds with the monopsony model, because monopsony presumes that you are on the labor supply. So once you introduce a minimum wage, you expand output. So that should lead to a reduction in prices rather than an increase in prices. So I wonder whether there is some to be thought about the effect of minimum wages on demand, a bit on the lines of what was suggested. So think that people may think that there is a fairer treatment of labor and they decide to buy more goods from firms that pay workers more. And the similar thing about also migration, whether we can, so you rightly pointed out that there is this role of compositional factors that also explains why policies look more at the composition of migrants, but Simon, on this one I'm not sure I agree fully with you. And so the compositional measures that are put in migration policies are coupled with quotas. So these are criteria to fill quotas. So there is both a quantitative limit and the compositional factor that are together. So PBS and this system are a way to fill the quotas. So to some extent, government do both, want to affect the composition of migration, but also the number of migrants. So if it were true that compositional factors were the most important things, then you would not have the quota part, you would have only the compositional. And here you have both. So one possible explanation is that you can't decide what the migrants will do. So it is possible that you put a threshold on educational levels, but once they are in, the migrants do jobs that for which they are overqualified. There is a lot of skill downgrading. At the end of the day, even high-skilled migrants may compete with low skills because they do jobs that are bad. So that's this thing of the downgrading is something important. So.
My name is Michał Gulczyński, and I'm a PhD student here at Bocconi. Thank you for the fascinating lecture and great comments as well. And I have two short questions. The first is empirical. We are looking at migration from the position of developed countries, or the richest countries, and we ask if immigration is good. But does it mean that out-migration and immigration are bad? Are they two sides of the same coin, and are they a null-sum game? And the second is more theoretical or research-oriented. You underlined, I think at least twice, that you are focusing or looking for big shocks. But often the same methods that you are using are used to look at very small shocks or very dubious, like rainfall or wolf attacks, the impact of wolf attacks on political behavior and voting preferences. What is your opinion on this kind of research, or this extension of the use of those methods?
Thanks very much to Erika and Simon for their comments. And I should have mentioned something at the very beginning of this lecture, which I didn't, which is this particular lecture is about stuff I did 30 years ago. I really do want to get across that there's been a lot of innovations since then. And there's a lot of interesting ongoing innovations, including work by these two and many others, probably many of you in the room. So I don't, and it's very difficult to keep track of all that work because there's just, as Erika said, there's just literally hundreds of studies. So I definitely don't want to weigh in on all these topics too much because, to tell you the truth, I don't work on them very much anymore. I do think that exactly agree with what Simon said, that more on the mechanisms and what exactly is going on is pretty important. In the United States, there's a pretty big move. We have a pretty big labor shortage, but people don't really know, very unacceptable to bring in more people. So there's going to be a big move to have the old-fashioned kind of temporary migrants, like the kind that led Turkish migrants to Germany. Now, of course, the fundamental rule is all temporary migrants become permanent. But that isn't necessarily true. Saudi Arabia runs a pretty strong temporary migrant program, and there is an element of that Saudi-type program in some of the agricultural migration programs in the U.S. and in Canada. So there is, and that's very closely related to this issue of what kinds of immigration we have, and that might be related to the equilibrium effects of immigration. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. I was fascinated by Erika's mention of the effort side of minimum wages. And that's something, unfortunately, Alan Kruger is no longer with us, but that would have been a topic that he would have really been super excited to hear about, and great to see that explored. And it does seem like I'm going to make a prediction. I don't usually believe in making predictions, but I'm going to make a prediction that efficiency wages are coming back as a research topic because they've been dead for 20 years. And there's a fundamental rule of zombieism in economic theory, which is no idea ever is dead. It's just temporarily in the grave. And this one is, you can see signs already that this idea is starting to come out. And so she's going to be on the forefront, I think, with that idea. Now, to answer the two questions, I think, oh, now I'm having trouble remembering what they were. Sorry. What were Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. Yeah, okay. So on out-migration, there's actually, that's an area where there's some really interesting stuff going on. I saw a paper the other day looking at what happened along the Sweden-Norway border. And as you all know, if you've been reading the newspaper in the last 20 years, Norway is doing extremely well. There's a lot of money floating around Norway. Sweden is not doing great, or not doing badly, but not nearly as well. And so there's been a big change, and it's led to a lot of migration, people working in Norway who are Swedes, because they can easily get across the border. And it does look like that has negative effects on the local Swedish economy, because in fact it seems like some of the best workers have left and gone to these jobs in Norway. And why that's important is because there's another very closely related puzzle in all of economics, which is, I always say, in the US context, we always state it this way: what's wrong with Appalachia? So that's the part of the United States and rural Kentucky and Tennessee, where wages are low, the labor market is depressed, unemployment is high, employment population rates are just miserable, well below what you would think of as Western standards, modern Western standards. And they've got huge problems with drug addiction, with the opioid epidemic, and so on. So, and it looks like one of the problems they face is all the people who grew up there, who have above average ability and ambition, move to San Francisco or New York. And so they're sort of suffering from the brain drain phenomenon. And so I think it's really going to be interesting over the coming decades to see, as we get more and more administrative data and understand what are the implications for different economies of migration, both sending and receiving. So thanks for that question. On the small shocks, I don't want to criticize any particular study. I have to say that in the early 1990s, a lot of people thought that natural experiments were a word. I got it from Richard Freeman, and I used it in my Mariel Boatlift paper. But sometime in the 1990s, Alan and I agreed we would never use that word because it was so discredited. Because people made fun of it. They thought of it like kind of your caricature of these quasi-experimental studies. The advantage of a big shock is when we think about migration, for instance, or you're often, from a priori reasoning, like George Borhaus's type of reasoning, looking for relatively small behavioral effects. So you need a big shock to actually be able to measure it. So if you think of it from the point of view of research design, I want to have an experiment with a big treatment, otherwise I'm not going to find anything. I'm just going to get insignificant results. And one interpretation of some of the literature is, maybe the shocks are too small, we can't sort them out, people specification search, and as a result, we're not really learning as much as we think we are. So the advantage of a large shock, I think, is that you can possibly parse out the causal effects you're interested in. The disadvantage is a lot of times those big shocks occur in very special circumstances.
So there's recent work for the US that has documented differential effects of the minimum wages depending on market structure by Marinescu and co-author, where they show basically that where markets are more concentrated, we observe sort of these potentially like positive employment effects, and the other way around for markets that are less concentrated. And I suppose kind of a similar argument could apply not just to minimum wages, but also to other like tax incidents more generally. So I was wondering kind of in light, if we take those results at face value, how would you think about basically kind of shaping policy basically in light of those results? What do they tell us about policy design? How could we design a minimum wage that can take into account that variation in market structure potentially?
Well, strangely enough, I don't ever get involved in policy design, so I'm not a big expert in it. Usually I've found in the past when I've gone to a meeting that I'm not very good at communicating to policymakers. They're thinking about some different question than me. But I think the state of research in the imperfect competition area is maybe not quite at the level where we should be jumping on the wagon of giving policy advice just yet. I think if we had another sets of work, or somebody went back and now, for instance, the increase in the minimum wage in Germany, the introduction of the minimum wage in Germany, there's a lot of different labor markets in Germany. People are aware that minimum wage probably had a different impact in the East than it had in Munich. Maybe there's something to be done, large administrative data sets, really nice quasi-experiment. So I think, but it says that there's a lot of work to be done. And my view is usually that if somebody said, okay, we've got to make a recommendation tomorrow afternoon, we could maybe come up with something. And that's often how policy is made in the United States. Like you saw that with the recent budget negotiations. There's a deadline looming and we've got to get some agreement and we're going to do it today. But I think it would be helpful to know if this imperfect competition paradigm is really a key part of the story. One thing that's true, for instance, is in a monopsonistic world, employers will let you shirk because they're paying you less than you're worth. And so one implication of a monopsonistic model is not just that you could have potentially different impacts of a minimum increase, but you would also see potential impacts on the willingness of firms to put up with shirking. So I think that's a kind of a thing that we can start thinking about now when some of these ideas are on the table.
Thank you, David, for the very interesting lecture. And my question is actually about not the research itself. I think everybody in this room thinks that economic research is very important, and we made a lot of progress in the last decades. But it's more about how to spread this research among the public opinion. So, for instance, here in Italy, the debate about migration and minimum wages is very confused. It's not based on evidence, both on the right wing and on the left wing. So you are also famous because your research made it to the public opinion. What do you think is the key to make the research more digestible by the public opinion?
Well, I actually think that to the extent you can influence people with evidence, it has to be incredibly simple evidence. So, in my new post-retirement career, I get asked to talk at Rotary clubs and things like that. We have a house in the wine area, so I'm like the #1 go-to guy when the Rotary Club in Santa Rosa, California needs a talk. So people there are they can, an average person can understand minimum wage paper that Kruger and I did, or the Mariel Boatlift study. When somebody says the word structural, they think that you're talking about building a bridge. So, if we're going to influence people's perceptions of the way the world works, and then I think we have to influence their understanding of the basic mechanisms. And if the story we're telling is that it's actually incredibly complicated, then I think we're going to have a lot of trouble getting people to understand it. So, and you can see there's a lot of reaction. Maybe some of the reaction in the populist movement implicitly is a reaction against technocratic control. You can really see elements of this in a lot of European countries. And if the underlying models that we use to set policies are, multi-equation general equilibrium models with 40 parameters calibrated off of whatever, there's no hope. So I think if we're going to try and make a case for some kind of policy intervention, we're going to have to try and have a very simple design-based evidence, because that's the only thing that people understand. And the very good example of that was the original motivation in the 1960s for the first social experiments in the United States, the so-called negative income tax experiments. So that was an era when the government was actually, trying to become more progressive, and they were thinking, okay, we could expand and change the welfare system, and we could expand and change health insurance. But everybody knew that was very complicated, so they said, well, let's run a giant social experiment where we've got people, in the health insurance experiment, there were people that had fairly generous health insurance, and there were people that had very, very parsimonious health insurance. And they followed them for 5 or 6 years and looked at all the things they did and their health outcomes and stuff. And that's still widely referred to in the health economics literature for certain key elasticities. And you can explain that experiment and what you were trying to figure out about people to the Rotary Club. So I think that's my #1 suggestion. Keep it simple.
Thank you. Thank Erika and Simon for a very nice discussion, really plenty of very good suggestions, and David for your very enlightening lecture. Very grateful for you to be here, also because I know that you have a lot of travel, and David will be back to Italy very soon, because on Friday afternoon at 6:30 p.m. in Torino during the Festival of Economics, he will deliver a lecture on looking forward, because it will be on the future of labor. And so I hope that also on that occasion we will wear a Visit Team's tie. It's something I appreciated very much. So thank you so much for being with us today. Ciao.